Sir, we need that seat for a priority passenger. Please move to the back. Now. The words, sharp and dismissive, cut through the cabin's hum. Major Thomas Harlow, 88, a man who'd faced enemy fire without flinching, looked up, his tired eyes meeting the cold indifference of the attendant. He said nothing, just folded his ticket, a first-class ticket gifted by Congress, and with quiet dignity made his way to a cramped seat at the back. The engines were ready, the plane moments from takeoff, when boots echoed down the aisle. A four-star general, 10 soldiers, all there for one man. The man crammed in economy, quietly clutching his boarding pass, the man they almost overlooked. And what happened next? It silenced the plane and changed everything. Major Tom Harlow, age 88, is not the kind of man who draws attention to himself. Born and raised in rural Nebraska, on the outskirts of a quiet farming town called Ashwood, Tom grew up surrounded by endless fields of wheat and corn. His father ran a small feed store, and his mother taught Sunday school at the local church. Life was simple, and Tom learned early the values that would define him: hard work, humility, and respect for others. Tom enlisted in the Army at 17, eager to serve during the final stretch of World War II, but by the time he finished training, the war had ended. Still determined to do his part, he stayed on, and soon enough found himself deployed to Korea as a young infantry officer. The frozen hills of the Korean peninsula became his proving ground. Tom earned his Silver Star during a brutal winter offensive, when he led a daring nighttime maneuver to rescue a trapped platoon. While the commendation recognized his bravery, Tom rarely spoke of the medal. To him, the real honor was bringing his men home alive. When Vietnam flared, Tom answered the call again. By then, he was older, more seasoned, and entrusted with greater responsibility. He commanded a company deep in the jungle, where survival often hinged as much on compassion as tactics. His men recall how he shared his rations with villagers, how he would walk the perimeter himself at night to reassure the younger soldiers, and how he always carried a small battered Bible given to him by his mother. The jungles left their marks, both seen and unseen. Tom returned home with shrapnel scars along his leg and memories that would quietly shape the rest of his life. After retiring from the military, Tom returned to Ashwood. He became a high school teacher, sharing his love for history with generations of students. He never sought recognition. He never displayed his medals or told stories unless asked. But in the community, Tom was quietly revered, not just for his service, but for his kindness. He volunteered at the local food pantry, coached Little League, and spent his Sundays visiting neighbors who could no longer leave their homes. At 88, Tom is traveling to Washington, D.C., not for himself, but because he was asked to speak at a National Veterans Leadership Forum, a gathering meant to bridge the generations of service and inspire new commitments to community and country. The organizers sent him a first-class ticket as a small thank you for his lifetime of service. To Tom, the class of the seat meant little. He cared only that he could contribute, that he might share a few words about leadership, integrity, and compassion. With his simple suitcase, his well-worn veteran's cap, and the invitation tucked into his shirt pocket, Tom boarded that plane with no expectation that the journey itself would test the very ideals he had lived by all his life. The morning sun filtered through the wide windows of Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport, casting long golden lines across the crowded terminal. Major Tom Harlow, 88, stood patiently at his gate, a modest figure in a sea of hurried travelers. His well-worn suitcase rested by his feet, and in his hand he held his boarding pass. First class, seat 2A, a seat gifted to him by the organizers of the National Veterans Leadership Forum in Washington, D.C. The ticket was meant to ease the aches of his shrapnel-scarred leg and honor the journey of a man who had served his country for over 3 decades. As boarding began, Tom waited his turn, stepping forward only when his group was called. No sense in rushing. He had never believed in claiming more space than necessary. When he finally stepped into the cabin, his eyes traced over the polished wood accents and the wide, comfortable seats of first class. He located 2A, placed his carry-on gently in the overhead compartment, and lowered himself slowly into the seat, letting out a small sigh as his back found support. The plane filled steadily. Business travelers tapped at laptops. A young couple settled into the row behind him, whispering excitedly about their honeymoon. Tom folded his hands over his lap, content to simply rest for a few moments. But then a voice broke the quiet hum of conversation. "Excuse me, sir." Tom looked up. Standing before him was a flight attendant, Rebecca Lang. Her uniform was crisp, her hair pulled into a tight bun, but there was a tension in her smile. "Yes, ma'am," Tom said softly. "I'm afraid there's been a last-minute adjustment. We're going to need this seat for one of our VIP clients. I'm going to ask you to relocate to seat 34B in economy." Tom blinked, processing the words. "My ticket says 2A, he said, holding it up, not defiantly, just quietly, as if to double-check the fact himself. "I understand, sir," Rebecca replied, her tone more formal now. "But these changes happen. Our loyalty program passengers have priority." The words felt like a slap, not because of the seat itself, but because of the disregard. Around him, passengers shifted uncomfortably. A businessman glanced over the top of his newspaper. The young couple behind him fell silent. Tom's face betrayed no anger, no outrage, only a quiet weariness. He glanced once more at his boarding pass, folded it carefully and tucked it into his shirt pocket. "If that's what needs to be done," he said, his voice even. Rebecca gave a tight nod, relieved to avoid a confrontation, and gestured toward the back of the plane. Tom rose, gripping the armrest for support as his leg twinged with the familiar pain of old wounds. He took down his bag and began the long walk down the aisle, past the rows of wide seats and settled passengers. His gait was steady, his back straight, a soldier's posture, despite the years. In economy, Tom found 34B, a middle seat between a teenager with headphones and a man whose elbows already spilled over the shared armrest. Tom placed his bag beneath the seat and eased himself down, biting back a wince as his knees pressed against the seat in front. Around him no one spoke, but many watched. Watched as the quiet old man, who had boarded with dignity, was displaced in favor of someone who hadn't yet arrived. Watched as he showed no bitterness, no complaint, only that quiet strength that had carried him through frozen hills and jungle heat alike. And outside the plane, unseen by Tom, the engines began to hum in preparation for takeoff. But something was about to happen, something that would make the entire cabin stop, look, and remember what true honor looked like. Captain Emily Harlow had always admired her grandfather. Growing up, she'd listened to his quiet stories, not of glory or medals, but of loyalty, of protecting the person beside you, of doing the right thing even when no one was watching. It was his example that led her to join the National Guard, and it was his example that kept her calm, even now as she watched what was unfolding before her on the plane. Emily was seated several rows behind first class across the aisle. She had watched with growing unease as the flight attendant approached her grandfather and spoke words she couldn't fully hear. But she didn't have to. The body language said it all. The attendant's polite but firm tone, the forced smile, the gesture toward the back of the plane. And then her grandfather's slow nod, his quiet acceptance, as he folded his boarding pass and gathered his things. Her stomach tightened. This wasn't right. She waited as he passed her row, offering him a reassuring smile. Tom managed a small one in return, though she could see the hint of pain in his eyes, not just from his leg, but from the sting of what had just happened. Emily rose from her seat and stepped into the aisle, catching the flight attendant's eye. "Excuse me," she said, keeping her voice controlled. "That man you just moved, do you know who he is?" Rebecca Lang hesitated. "I'm sorry, ma'am. This was a necessary change. We have priority clients who—" "I didn't ask about your policies. I asked if you know who he is." Emily's tone was still respectful but firm now. Rebecca faltered. "No, ma'am, I don't." Emily drew a breath, weighing her options. Causing a scene wouldn't help, but letting this stand wasn't acceptable. She glanced at the other passengers, many of whom were now watching with interest, sensing the tension. Without another word, Emily returned to her seat and pulled out her phone. She hesitated for just a second. Her grandfather wouldn't want to fuss. But this wasn't about fuss. This was about respect. She scrolled through her contacts and found the name she needed. Colonel Alan Davis, her former commanding officer, a man who owed his life to her grandfather's heroics in Vietnam. She hit call. "Captain Harlow," came the familiar voice. "Colonel." I need a favor, sir. My grandfather, Major Thomas Harlow, is on this flight with me. They just moved him out of first class. It was his assigned seat. I tried to resolve it quietly, but the line went silent for a beat. Say no more, Captain, Davis said, his voice low with steel. Give me the flight number. We'll take it from here. As Emily ended the call, she felt a surge of relief. The wheels were now in motion. Wheels of respect, of loyalty, of justice that would not be ignored. Emily's heart pounded with a slow, steady anger. Not the kind that made you lash out, but the kind that settled deep, quiet, and resolved. From where she sat, she could still see her grandfather, Major Thomas Harlow, squeezed between two strangers near the back of the plane. His tall frame, once straight as a rifle barrel, now hunched slightly, trying to fold itself into a seat clearly never designed for a man like him. His worn veteran's cap shaded his eyes, but she knew what he felt. She had seen it in that brief glance they'd shared as he passed. A glance that said, "It's fine, Emily. Let it go." But she wouldn't let it go. She drew a slow breath and scrolled through her phone, her thumb hovering for a moment over a name she hadn't called in months. Colonel Alan Davis. Not just a colleague, not just an officer. A man who owed his life to her grandfather. The call connected on the second ring. Captain Harlow? The voice was deep, warm, familiar, steady as a rock, even across the distance. Colonel, I need a favor. You name it, Davis said immediately, no hesitation. It's about my grandfather. We're on a flight to D.C. He had a first-class ticket. Congress gave it to him for the Veterans Forum. But they moved him. Economy, middle seat, gave his place to some frequent flyer. The line went quiet for a second, and Emily could almost hear Davis's mind shift into gear. Your grandfather, Davis said slowly, his voice tinged with memory, saved my hide in Vietnam. Mekong Delta, 68. We were pinned down, no way out. I was sure that was it. Then Tom Harlow charged in, let us out. I've never forgotten. I never will. Emily's voice caught for just a second. They treated him like he was no one, sir. Like he didn't matter. Davis didn't need to hear more. Give me your flight number, airline. Gate if you got it. She rattled off the details, glancing out the window where the runway stretched beneath the morning sun. The engines hummed, the crew prepared for takeoff. Sit tight, Captain, Davis said, his voice low and firm. We'll take care of this. You have my word. The call ended, but Davis wasn't done. He immediately picked up his secure line and dialed General Samuel Grant, commander of the air base near the airport. Grant answered on the first ring. Davis, what's wrong? We've got a Silver Star veteran, Tom Harlow. They disrespected him on a commercial flight. I want to make this right. Grant didn't need convincing. He knew Harlow's name, knew the story. I'll handle it personally. Tell Emily her grandfather's about to be reminded that this country still remembers. And so the chain of respect began. A chain forged on battlefields, strengthened by loyalty, and now stretching from offices to airport terminals, ready to restore honor where it was due. Colonel Alan Davis didn't waste a second. The moment he ended the call with Emily, he reached for his desk phone and dialed a direct number that few people had. The personal line of General Samuel Grant, commander of the air base located just miles from the airport. General Grant picked up on the first ring. Davis, what's going on? Sam, I need your help. It's about Major Tom Harlow. He's on a commercial flight, and they just moved him out of first class. Gave his seat to some loyalty program passenger. He's sitting crammed into economy. No explanation that makes sense. They humiliated him, Sam. We can't let this stand. For a brief moment, the line was silent. But it wasn't hesitation. Grant was processing, calculating. He knew the name Tom Harlow. Every officer of their generation did. The man was a legend, not because he bragged or sought glory, but because of what he'd done. Stories of Harlow's bravery in Korea and Vietnam were still told at military academies. Tom Harlow? Grant repeated as if making sure he'd heard right. Yes, the same Tom Harlow who pulled my squad out of that nightmare in the Mekong. The same Tom Harlow who's given his whole life to this country. They treated him like he's no one. I want to make it right. You don't even need to ask, Alan. We're on it. What airline? What flight? Davis gave the details. Flight number, airline, Gate. Grant was already moving as they spoke, snapping his fingers at his aide, signaling for a rapid deployment. I'll go myself, and I'll bring a team. It's time that airline and everyone in that terminal sees how we honor our veterans. Within minutes, General Grant had assembled 10 soldiers. They were a mix of ranks and service histories, some fresh from recent deployments, others seasoned veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan. Each of them knew the name Tom Harlow. Each of them understood that this wasn't just about one man's seat on a plane. This was about showing the world that respect for those who served was not optional. The team moved with precision, donning their dress uniforms, making sure every medal, every ribbon, every insignia was perfectly in place. Their boots shined, their posture impeccable. At the base gate, a convoy of dark military SUVs waited, engines idling. General Grant climbed into the lead vehicle, his face set in determination. The soldiers followed, silent but focused. The convoy sped toward the airport, lights flashing just enough to clear a path, but not to create spectacle. As they approached the terminal, passengers inside began to notice. The line of military vehicles pulling up, the soldiers stepping out in unison. The sound of boots on the marble floor echoed through the terminal as the team advanced toward the gate. General Grant led the way, his presence commanding, his purpose clear. This wasn't about making noise. It was about restoring dignity. And they were going to do it the right way, by showing the honor Major Tom Harlow had earned 100 times over. The scene at Gate B12 had shifted from ordinary to extraordinary in the span of moments. Passengers who had been preoccupied with their phones, coffee cups, and boarding passes now stood frozen, their attention riveted on the sight unfolding outside the terminal windows. A convoy of dark military SUVs had come to a stop with precision near the gate. The doors opened in sync, and out stepped General Samuel Grant, flanked by 10 soldiers in immaculate dress uniforms. Their boots struck the pavement in unison, creating a rhythm that echoed across the concourse, silencing even the loudest announcements overhead. There was no mistaking their purpose. The soldiers formed up behind the general, their posture perfect, their faces set with solemn determination. Each of them bore the weight of duty, but also the honor of standing for a man who had given his life in service to their country. As the team moved through the terminal, a wave of silence followed them. The casual chatter of travelers ceased. A mother gently pulled her curious child closer. A man lowered his briefcase and removed his hat. Airport employees stepped aside instinctively, their eyes wide with surprise and respect. At the gate, the staff stumbled over their words, unsure whether to stop the advancing formation or simply watch history walk past. General Grant offered only a nod of acknowledgement, never breaking stride. There was no time to explain. His mission was clear. The jet bridge creaked beneath the weight of duty as the soldiers advanced, boots striking in unison. Inside the aircraft, passengers barely noticed at first. But when the first boot hit the cabin floor, the sound, solid, certain, cut through the hum of air vents and idle conversations. Heads turned, phones were lowered, music was silenced. One by one, passengers realized they were witnessing something remarkable. General Grant led his team down the narrow aisle, his eyes scanning, his steps measured. The soldiers followed, a column of respect moving through the heart of the aircraft. Passengers pressed themselves back in their seats to give way. Some placed their hands over their hearts. A child whispered to his mother, asking who the soldiers had come for, and then they reached him. Major Thomas Harlow, 88, sat quietly in his cramped economy seat, his tall frame folded awkwardly, his cap tilted low, the boarding pass still clutched gently in his hands. His face, lined with age and experience, turned upward as the general came to a stop. Major Harlow, General Grant said, his voice carrying through the hushed cabin, on behalf of the United States Armed Forces, I want to personally apologize for what happened today. No man who has given as much as you should ever be made to feel invisible. Please, sir, let us honor you properly. Tom blinked, surprised by the sudden presence. The weight of the moment. His first instinct was to wave it off. That's not necessary, General, he said softly. Really, it's just a seat. Sure, on him. Grant shook his head, his voice gentle but firm. It's not about the seat, sir. It's about what it represents. Please, let us do this for you. Two soldiers stepped forward, offering steady arms as Tom slowly rose. His back straightened, his posture still carrying the strength of the young officer he once was. Together they began the walk down the aisle. The cabin was utterly silent. Passengers watched with respect, with awe. A businessman who had earlier grumbled about delays now lowered his eyes. A young woman wiped at a tear. Even the teenager with headphones pulled them down and stared, humbled by the sight. As Tom reached the front of the plane, General Grant gestured to seat 2A, the seat that had been his all along. "Your seat, Major," Grant said, his voice full of reverence. Tom settled into the wide chair. His legs stretched with relief. His back found its comfort. But more than that, he felt his dignity restored, not by the seat itself, but by the respect it symbolized. The soldiers stood at attention. General Grant saluted. And in that moment, the passengers knew they had witnessed something far greater than a seating correction. They had seen honor in action, and they would not forget it. As the soldiers filed off the plane, leaving behind the restored dignity of Major Thomas Harlow, the cabin remained unusually quiet. The usual bustle of pre-takeoff final checks, the casual chatter, the rustle of magazines, gone. In their place was a shared, unspoken reverence that hung in the air. Passengers who had witnessed the entire moment felt changed. A businessman who moments before had been annoyed by the delay now stared out the window, deep in thought. A young couple exchanged quiet glances, their hands instinctively finding each other's. Even the teenager with headphones had pulled them down, watching Major Harlow with newfound respect. Tom, seated comfortably now in his rightful place, felt the weight of the moment too, but he carried no bitterness, no pride, just a quiet sense of peace that, at least today, the values he had lived his life by had not been forgotten. When the plane finally touched down in Washington, D.C., the passengers erupted into applause, not the polite kind offered after a bumpy landing, but genuine, heartfelt applause, a gesture of respect, of admiration, of collective gratitude. Tom rose slowly, his body still weary from the long flight, but his heart lighter. As he made his way toward the exit, people reached out to shake his hand, to offer thanks, to simply nod in recognition. His fellow passengers no longer saw just an old man. They saw the hero he had always been, even in quiet anonymity. Waiting at the door was Rebecca Lang, the flight attendant who had, unintentionally, set this chain of events in motion. Her face was pale, her posture no longer confident but humble. "Major Harlow," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "I want to say, I am so sorry. I didn't know. I didn't see who you were." Tom paused, looking at her with kind but steady eyes. "Miss," he said softly, "the problem wasn't that you didn't see who I was. The problem was that you didn't see that any man, any woman, uniform or not, deserves dignity." Her eyes welled with tears. "You're right. I promise I've learned something today I'll never forget." Tom offered a small smile and a gentle nod. Then it was worth it. Meanwhile, at the airline's headquarters, by the time the plane had landed, the story had already gone viral. A passenger's video of the military escort, the salute, and the return to first class had spread across social media platforms, amassing hundreds of thousands of views in just hours. Inside the sleek glass offices of Atlantic Frontier Airlines, CEO Richard Lane stood at the window of his corner office, staring out at the departing flights. His assistant Margaret entered quietly, holding a tablet displaying the trending video. "Richard," she said gently, "it's everywhere. News outlets are picking it up. The comments are flooding in. People are furious and inspired." Lane rubbed a hand down his face, weary but resolute. "Schedule a meeting. All senior leadership. Now." Within an hour, executives crowded into the boardroom, the screen at the front playing the video on loop. Lane stood at the head of the table. "This," he said, gesturing to the footage, "is not who we are, and it won't happen again. I want a new policy, effective immediately. No veteran holding a valid ticket of any class will ever be displaced or disrespected on one of our flights again. And not just veterans. This is about basic human dignity." They called it the Harlow Protocol, a formal policy that recognized and honored veterans on every flight, ensuring priority assistance, respect, and support. Rebecca Lang, the attendant, volunteered to transfer to the airline's training division, where she began teaching new hires about respect, service, and the lessons she'd learned from Major Harlow. Her sessions always started with that video. Other airlines took notice. Within months, more than a dozen companies adopted similar policies, inspired by the courage of a quiet man who hadn't asked for recognition, but whose dignity had reminded a nation of what mattered. And for Tom Harlow, that was enough. The grand hall of the Capitol was filled with a quiet anticipation as people took their seats. The room, adorned with American flags and portraits of heroes from generations past, felt charged with meaning. Veterans of every conflict since World War II sat in places of honor at the front. Men and women who had served in Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf, Iraq, and Afghanistan. Their faces, lined with experience, reflected both pride and sorrow, the dual inheritance of service. When Major Thomas Harlow stepped onto the stage, the room rose as one in a standing ovation. But Tom didn't walk with the swagger of a man seeking applause. He walked as he always had, steady, humble, focused on the task at hand. He approached the podium, adjusted the microphone, and removed his cap, holding it respectfully in his hands. "Thank you," he began, his voice clear but gentle. The applause faded into a respectful silence. "I stand before you today, not because of what I did, but because of what so many have done, what so many continue to do." He paused, glancing at the veterans before him, at the young cadets seated in the gallery, at the members of Congress who had gathered to honor them. "I'm no different from any of you," he continued. "I didn't wear this uniform for praise or privilege. I wore it because I believed in something bigger than myself. I believed in the promise of this country, not just for those who wear the uniform, but for every citizen who calls it home." Tom reached into his pocket and pulled out the small, worn silver star he had kept with him all these years. He held it between his fingers, letting the light catch on its surface. "This medal doesn't make me better than anyone else," he said quietly. "It's not the medal that matters. It's what it stands for. Courage isn't about charging into battle without fear. It's about standing up for what's right, even when it's hard, even when it costs you." He set the medal gently on the podium, as if offering it back to the nation. "I don't ask for special treatment for veterans," he said. "We didn't serve for that. But I do ask this. Let us be a country where no one, uniformed or not, is treated as if they don't matter. Let us honor the quiet dignity of service, whether on the battlefield or in everyday life. Let us remember that our strength isn't measured by medals or speeches, but by how we treat one another when no one is watching." As Tom stepped back from the podium, the applause that rose wasn't just for him. It was for the values he spoke of, for the ideals that bound them all together. And in that hall, at least for that moment, those values felt alive and unshakable. Major Thomas Harlow never asked for applause. He never sought attention. What he did, on distant battlefields, in quiet classrooms, in small acts of kindness, was done not for recognition, but because it was right. His story reminds us that real heroes often walk among us unnoticed, until a moment forces the world to stop and see them for who they are. What happened on that plane wasn't just about one man's seat. It wasn't about class or privilege. It was about dignity. It was about whether we, as a society, are willing to pause our busy lives long enough to honor those who've sacrificed so much for the freedoms we take for granted every day. Tom's quiet strength reminds us that respect doesn't need fanfare. It starts in small moments, holding a door, offering a seat, listening with genuine care. And it extends to recognizing that behind every elderly face, every worn pair of boots, every faded veteran's cap, there's a lifetime of stories, of service, of silent courage. Now it's our turn. Let this story be more than just something that touched you for a few minutes. Let it inspire action. Look around your own community. Is there a veteran who could use a kind word? Is there a neighbor who has quietly given more than they've ever received? Is there someone who has served others without ever asking for thanks? Here's what you can do. Show respect in daily interactions, not just to those in uniform, but to anyone who carries themselves with quiet dignity. Share this story. Let it remind others of the values that bind us as Americans. Leave a comment below. Share your thoughts, your gratitude, or your own story of someone whose quiet heroism inspired you. And if you haven't already, subscribe to this channel. Help us continue sharing these stories, stories that remind us of the goodness, courage, and kindness still alive in our communities. Together, we can build a culture that doesn't wait for a general and his soldiers to remind us what respect looks like. Together, we can choose dignity, compassion, and honor every single day. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next story.